Okay, hi everyone. The timer is 2, 1. There we go. Okay. There we go. Time's up. So, welcome everybody to the Bioethics lecture today. I'm really, really excited to let Gogol present his topic. So, just some little housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted throughout the talk. Gogol will ask some questions, and you can type out your answers in the lectures and conferences channel. And at the very end, there might be some room for discussion, which you will be able to unmute and talk. So without further ado, take it away when you're ready.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks for having me here. I'm really happy to be able to give this talk on Biocord. And let me see if I can get the screen sharing to work quite right. And I have a couple slides. I was told that some people really like slides, so I made sure to have some. Okay. Everyone can see my slides okay? Okay, good.
Do you want to try just flicking through to the next one?
Yeah, that good?
I'm not seeing them.
Oh, damn. Let me see. Still see them?
Your stream has ended.
When I tab away from to actually be able to flip through them, it actually it turns away.
Might have.
Let me try. I'm going to try unsharing and resharing one more time.
Do you want to flick through them now?
Let me try one more time.
I wasn't on Kraken's. I was on Gogol's one. Maybe it was just my computer.
Can you see the? Can you see the slides?
It's just loading.
Everyone see things well enough?
Yeah, I can see them now. It might have been my laptop. Sorry. Carry on.
Okay, very good. All right, well, technology always pushes back as much as we like to think we're in charge of the damn thing. Anyways, welcome everyone. The title of the talk I have for you today is Ethics for Biologists, Fundamentals and Applications. I was hoping to be able to look on in the chat to see what people are saying as it goes on, but unfortunately I think Discord streaming is in such a way that I can't actually be looking at the application while I have my slides up, so sorry if I missed something. I'm sure that Dr. Frogs or other people can flag me down, because I have a couple points where I want to be able to ask a couple things. The way I have this set up is I'm going to talk for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, wherever it may be, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end for people to ask questions. I'm sure this is kind of a new topic area for a lot of people, and I want to make sure that if something's unclear or you have other stuff you want to be able to talk about, that there'll be time at the end for you to say whatever you'd like to. Okay, so what this presentation promises on the tin here is I want to be able to talk a bit about what's going on at the basic level of normative ethics, because I'm sure that a lot of people, through being in STEM and in other things, you've had an ethics component to your instruction before. My undergraduate was in chemical engineering, so I saw the way it worked from the inside, and I'm sure your experience is probably pretty similar to mine, where what ethics was when you had an ethics component in your senior level classes meant that just on a given day you were handed a case study, you all read it, you all talked about it, and then that was ethics. There's a value to doing case studies, and especially if you contextualize them the right way, but I want to actually be able to give people some of the ideas, some of the language, and some of the fundamentals to actually understand, okay, when we're doing ethics, what does it actually look like? What sorts of things are going on such that this is even like a coherent thing to talk about in the first place? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the fundamental terminology we use in this field. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the idea of, let's say you actually wanted to investigate an ethical concept. And then I think a really important thing that I want to be able to seize on, and which is going to make up a lot of my presentation today, is the idea of concept analysis, which is once we have a nicely formulated question that we're trying to investigate as a matter of ethical investigation. One of the ways that we can proceed to do that as a question of method is to take the concepts that are involved in that question statement and actually try to tease them apart, expand them, figure out what's going on in them, because oftentimes the concepts we use in a really straightforward way have enough complexity to them that if we don't actually explore the depths of that, we're making a bad mistake. I also realize that before I get started into the real main thrust of the presentation here, I should say a quick little something about myself. So I go by Gogol on Discord. I'm a PhD student in bioethics and philosophy. So this is my area of research. I studied philosophy for a master's program before this. And then I come from a chemical engineering background, like I said. So I've seen a lot of different sides of both the medical and the philosophical, and being able to bring them together into this middle space in bioethics makes the field a really special one to explore, and one which, is not only important, but a lot of people will be able to bring a lot to the table for, even if you've never studied this field directly in and of itself. So to start, I want to talk about this basic idea called normativity. And the idea of normativity is going to be something, you sometimes hear people say normative ethics, right? And without knowing what normativity is, you might be lost at what the hell that is and why we're adding this word in front of ethics. But understanding what we mean by normativity is going to help us unlock exactly the structure and context of some of these important statements we might want to make. So when we say the word ethics, we could be talking about a lot of different things. Normally, people are going to mean something like normative ethics when they say ethics. But another way we could take that, there's also valuable projects in what we might call descriptive ethics, and a couple other fields that we're not really going to talk a lot about today, but just so it's out there, there's a field known as value theory, which is just trying to explore the structure of what sorts of things are valuable in the first place, what sorts of things that we think would be good for people to possess or act towards. And then metaethics, which is I'm going to give you some of the basic scaffold of normative ethics today. Metaethics is going to ask questions about why that scaffolding is like it is. And there are really interesting questions you can ask in that. It's just not stuff that we're really going to have time for today. And truthfully, not a field that I happen to know a tremendous amount about. So one of the most immediate ways we can try to access this question of what constitutes normativity is to try to explore the difference in language between what happens when we formulate a sentence using ought and a sentence using is. And in doing that, we're going to get to the difference between normativity and description, which I'm sure are two terms you'll remember from the slide preceding this. So I'm going to go through two examples first, and then use those examples to tease out what we actually mean by this distinction. So, like I said, normative statements are going to concern statements that involve words like ought, and descriptive statements are going to mostly involve matters of description using words like is. So let's take these two statements for example. A descriptive statement we might be, and I've keyed most of my examples and all that stuff into medical practice, but just because that's the place I work in most. But bioethics is something that's going to be also useful to think about for laboratory biologists and so on. But this is just the language I've used for now. So a descriptive statement might be: most people in our hospital think that euthanasia is wrong. But then we have a normative statement we can make as well. Euthanasia is in fact wrong, or euthanasia is in fact permissible. Now, what's going on in all these things is there's a split between the attitudes people have towards most things and what the actual fact of the matter is towards it. This is something that works analogously in science, although there's going to be a slight wrinkle that I'm going to bring up in a second. I can say descriptively that, say, most people in this town think the Earth is flat. And that's true. Most people in this town might think that the Earth is flat. Another statement I could then make is a statement of fact concerning whether or not the Earth is in fact flat. And that second order statement we can evaluate that outside of the attitudes people have towards the thing. But notice I've said something a little earlier that doesn't quite manifest on the slide, which is that normativity is concerning questions of ought, and descriptiveness is concerning questions of is, and I mean, how the hell does that work in this context? Well, notice when I'm using the words wrong or permissible, these words are going to decompose in a way that we're going to make reference to words like ought. So when I say euthanasia is in fact wrong, what I mean by that is you ought not to do euthanasia. When I say euthanasia is in fact permissible, I could say something like, it's not true that you ought not do euthanasia. If euthanasia is demanded of you in a circumstance, you can say you ought to euthanize, right? And this is a pattern of language that if you don't understand the difference, you don't understand what we mean by the word ought, things are going to become quite difficult. And in fact, this is actually a thing which is going to appear in a lot of, I'm not going to call them science popularizers or philosophy types, but I'll call them maybe pop intellectuals, get away by blurring this distinction. So when I say that you ought to do something, I mean, what I mean is similar to what the language in fact directly suggests, which is that you should do it. It concerns matters of obligation. And that one of the structures of ethics is to explore, okay, what sorts of things ought we to do? And we can speak about these obligations as a matter of fact. We can speak about and say, it's true that you ought to do something. But what's important is that we're actually trying to isolate, we're asking the more general question about what ought we to do. I'll give you an example where this, if you don't recognize this distinction, your discussion becomes almost impossible. So I'm sure people have heard of Jordan Peterson, right? And he has this crazy analogy where he looks at the way serotonin, what was it? The way in which serotonin in lobsters like reinforces some sort of social hierarchy, and he uses this as an analogy to say, well, therefore, hierarchical structures are necessary in humans as well. And you can only make such a statement like that if you completely misunderstand the difference between description and normativity, to the extent that the metaphor just completely blows up on the runway before you can even get started. So it's true descriptively that you can find examples in nature where you have a type of social hierarchy that's maintained by levels of serotonin. However, it does not follow that humans ought to adopt similar social hierarchies. This simple description of what's going on in the outside world is not by itself going to get you to the level of normativity. Normativity works in a different way. And if you conflate normativity with description, you're going to have deep problems. Imagine what would happen if we blurred the two examples I've given on the slide here. It does not follow from the fact that most people in our hospital think that euthanasia is wrong, that we ought not ever to euthanize. It does not follow that euthanasia is in fact wrong. So when we're doing normative ethics, we want to rise to the status where we're actually questioning what ought we to do, what ought we not to do in its purest form. Okay. Yeah, so I have a question for people here, which is, so we can, even though I've set up this distinction that we can separate normativity from descriptiveness, the two terms are not wholly insulated from one another. It's not the case that doing descriptive work will give you no insight into normativity, nor vice versa. So this might be a good place for people to mention if something's confusing to them, because I understand this might be new terminology, but I have a question to people, which is, what might the relevance of the empirical sciences be to normativity? Even if I've given you an example where doing empirical scientific work might end up really badly, what might be a way in which actually the empirical sciences could contribute to normativity? That if I click back to Discord, have you lost my slides, or you still see things? Okay, very good. Oh, good. So I can actually sort of self-monitor my own questions here. Gonna keep the cursor moving because I noticed it keeps going stream paused. Yeah, the question is, okay, so I've set up a distinction where simple description is not the same thing as normativity. The example I brought up was that if you look at the way, say, certain social hierarchies work in other animals, it doesn't follow that humans ought to act that way. But the question is, okay, given that that's a mistake, are there still ways in which the empirical sciences can be relevant in trying to explore normativity? Yeah, so Dr. Frogs has an interesting idea, which is one of the interactions is we can use our normative resources to help shape our scientific resources. Dr. Frogs has said we can ask the question, what ought we to investigate? If we know our investigations are biased, say, or what sorts of outcomes should we look for? I think that's a great way in which normativity can be helpful for us to do our scientific work. Good. So Leo has a point which I think might sound funny on the surface, but I think actually, if we take in a different way, actually could get us towards a pretty interesting answer. Okay, so Leo says, if population A pets more cats than population B, and population A is happier, then ought we to pet more cats to become happier? Now, there's a trick in your question that I want us to be able to separate, which is we would need if we can decide that you can become more joyful through petting cats, that by itself doesn't actually get us anywhere. What we would need is also to decide then that it's good to seek joy, it's good to become joyful. However, if we have this idea that we ought to act towards increasing our joy, then actually the types of studies that Leo's mentioning would be very useful to us. The types of empirical investigations we're talking about won't tell us that joy is a good thing. But if we know that joy is a good thing, they can be very helpful for telling us, well, what sorts of things create joy? Does that make sense? I think so. Okay. Yeah, so the idea is that if we have certain things that are valuable and we're doing this type of normative investigation to what's valuable, it's still very relevant for us to then use the other tools we have, such as a scientific investigation, to then figure out how to secure those values. So the trick is, the empirical investigation you're doing is a pretty major problem in philosophy, so I'm going to bracket that for now. But in terms of the natural sciences, we first need to decide what our goals are before we can get any oughts out of it. Yeah, I agree with that as a general way of framing that relationship. Very good. Okay. So those are some of the basic ideas we're going to be working with, some of the basic ideas of normativity, of description, and their relation. So let's say that you, as a biologist or as a medical scientist or still just a student, you're curious, okay, great. I want to start to know about what sorts of ethical obligations we have. I want to do an investigation into ethics. So one of the ways, I mean, there's an interesting series of questions related to methodology, like how do you actually set up an investigation? I mean, these are an analogous set of problems that I'm sure all of you have experienced in your own scientific work, where you can't just go out blind. There's a way in which you actually want to figure out ahead of time, like what sorts of ways am I going to try to go about solving this? So let's start with the question of, how do I actually formulate an ethical question? So I wrote a list of things that I think are interesting, and these are all questions we could try to talk about in medicine. What does a just distribution of health resources look like? Under what circumstances can you coerce someone into medical treatment? When is it justifiable to discontinue medical treatment? What are the proper goals of the healthcare system? So all these are classic problems in the field, right? So what does a just distribution of health resources look like? We've seen that it's one of the ways this has been a very active topic is towards the early parts of the COVID-19 pandemic when ventilators were in extremely short supply, and now currently in India, oxygen is in an extremely short supply. Given a scarcity of resources, how do you decide what to do with them? Or given the fact that organs are scarce, how should you distribute those resources? Not just how are they being distributed, but how should we? Under what circumstances can you coerce someone into medical treatment? We in the U.S. recognize a pretty wide latitude of people to refuse health treatment, but if there are cases where we think someone is in ignorance of the facts of the case and they're in such a way that it poses grave harm to themselves, there are situations where coercion is permissible. When is it justifiable to discontinue medical treatment? This relates to some of the euthanasia questions we had earlier. Is it always the case that you have to attempt the maximum level of intervention at all times? Well, most people think no. Most people think that at the moment where a treatment would be medically futile, that it's okay. And then what are the proper goals of the healthcare system? Well, it seems to have something to do with health, but is it something more? Is it trying to look at what would allow your patient to flourish, or is it even something different altogether? Just by way of saying that, one of the ways we can start this investigation is just to ask a question. If we come up against something in our real world practice that makes us wonder, like, what actually is the ethically appropriate thing to do here? One of the ways to start is to try to take what bothers us about this particular circumstance and try to formulate a question that's going to give us that, if we can answer this question, will always also give us the answer to our particular problem. Now, one of the tools that I want to teach today is a way in which we can do conceptual analysis, which is going to be a really important tool that will allow us to start to begin this process of answering our question. And it's going to do it in such a way that we're sort of entering something that's a little bit dialectic, where we're going to formulate a question, we're going to tease apart some of the concepts, and then the concepts are going to allow us to ask even better questions. So let's take a given question that might be good. How much latitude can patients justifiably be given to act in ways that are contrary to their health? That question comprehensible to people? Like, you understand what I mean by asking that question? You get the basic idea? Yeah, drink, smoke, but even, this is a way. There are ways where we can do sort of by latitude, we might mean, well, if you smoke, we'll charge you more on your insurance premiums. But this is also like one of the arguments of suicide prevention is that you can't act in a way that's really that radically contrary to your own state of health. If someone is a threat to themselves or others, it might be a place where we say you have no latitude. We're actually going to commit you at this point. Yeah, remove treatment could also be something spy. That could be another way too. These are the types of things I'm interested in saying in this question. So it's a big sort of category question which could have multiple different things within it. Another way, DC Kill says, should they be allowed to adhere to religious or dietary, sorry, the window's blocking me, rules even in contravention of medical treatment or advice? Yeah, right. So those are all types of things I mean by that question. So what I've done in this question then is I've underlined a couple of important concepts that are going to help us to actually figure out what the hell we mean by this question. I sort of understand what I mean by the question. I'm the one who asked it, but I'm using words whose meaning isn't necessarily immediately obvious. So, for example, when I say the word patience, do I mean someone who's currently under the control of the healthcare system? And if so, is that a separate class of people than an average citizen? I mean, how much control? We typically would say that a hospital can't go out and just seize someone from their own house, but you can be committed if you're already in contact with the healthcare system in some way. So what does it mean to be a patient in that context? And does that really create like a new category of people who we have different obligations towards? And if so, maybe we should get rid of that. I don't know. Just to say that this is one concept that we need to actually figure out what we mean by it in order to ask this question well. Justification. How much latitude can a patient's justifiably be given? I mean, this is effectively making it an ethical question. We could ask just a legal question and drop the word justifiably off. If you go to an average hospital and ask this question, they mean legal. Like a hospital, when you say ethics to a hospital, they think compliance. They think, well, what does the law say? We're going to hand this over to our legal team. And now the law is something relevant, and it's something that we should pay attention to if we're in the field, but it's not going to exhaust the question at all of what justifiably can be done. I mean, if for no other reason that what justifiably can be done should help shape what we think the law is in the first place. I underlined some words like act. Now, act by itself, you might think that, of course, what I mean by act is obvious, but we might relate this to questions like, what does it mean to have agency or control over one's actions? I mean, what would it mean to say that, someone who's acting involuntarily, because often when we say a person acts, we want to do things like relate some of their own ability to be responsible, or relate some of their own agency, or relate some of their control to what it is they're doing. So I'm just pointing out that when we ask this question, we might gloss over that point, but it's something to consider. Contrary to health, and health, I suppose, are probably going to look in the same way, but it's not at all obvious to me immediately what we mean by health, and if we're going to justify practices like commitment or so on through answering questions like this, well, we should really know what it is we're talking about. And what I want to make clear here is that we're not just arguing semantics. I find that, I'm sure you've had this experience yourself, that if you talk about philosophy or ideas on the internet, you get two people and they'll disagree immediately and yell at each other, and then the person will say, oh, you're just arguing semantics. Okay, I mean, you can argue semantics, but trying to figure out what words mean in these contexts is not just arguing semantics. We actually want to figure out, because, I mean, even more than just terms, we're talking about concepts here, right? We're trying to figure out what these concepts are. And it seems worthwhile to me to figure that out. And if we don't, well, I mean, it's really difficult to actually even answer this question if we don't know what the terms in it mean, if we don't know what the concepts in it mean. And so one of the things I want to teach people in this talk is some of the basic ways to do conceptual analysis. So what I picked for us is to try to talk about health. Health is a term that everyone sort of has an intuitive understanding of, most everyone. But boy, is it a tough one. And it's going to be an interesting word or interesting concept for us to explore. Not only because it has a really important role in a lot of the work that all of us do. How many people get grants from the National Institute of Health, or how many people work in medicine and all that. But it's a word that has a kind of like existential import to us. Don't you want to be healthy, right? And then, I mean, it's also a word where very few things still have this same type of connotation, where if someone asks, why are you doing that? And then you just say, well, for my health, like the explanation stops there. People are willing to accept that. So what is it? So I wrote a couple questions that let's just say that you were trying to ask our earlier question, which is how much latitude can we give patients to act in a way that's contrary to their health? And let's just say you want to know, like, well, what is that concept health we're using? Here are some follow-up questions you can ask about it. The most obvious one is like, what is health? Be good to know. Related question, what does it mean to be healthy? How do we know if someone's healthy? In philosophy, we might call this an epistemological question, which just is a fancy word meaning the study of knowledge, right? So certain things might be true, but even if they're true, we might ask, well, how do we know that they're true? This is like the discussion that goes into the scientific method. This is a nice, scientific method is a nice tool for helping to try to figure out what things are true, but our justification of that method is different from our assessment of whether or not certain things are true themselves, right? Here's an important one that might slip your attention when first talking about it, which is, what attitudes should we have to health? I mean, if we say that health is a good thing, that means it's valuable. So we should probably try to promote health, right? What are the relationships between health and disease? I mean, so is health just the absence of disease? Can you be healthy and diseased at the same time? By way of trying to, I'm not trying to tell you the answers to these right now, but just by way of saying, well, look, take this concept and just figure out what it's like. The way I like to describe this with an image is, you ever go to try to skip rocks across the water? And then before you do it, you kind of take the rock in your hand and you throw it up and down to yourself a few times and really get the feel of it and see what it's like. That's kind of what we're doing to these words. We're trying to or these concepts. We're trying to figure out what's actually going on with them. Because if we're going to use these things, either as if we think we should pursue health, but we don't know what health is, we're kind of lost. And we don't have to know what it is perfectly, but let's have some idea. So how might we actually go about exploring this concept? We could propose some preliminary definitions. If you think you know what health is, well, let's say so. Let's see what it's. Let's assess that definition. Other things that we could try to do, we could try to find examples of things that look like health. Like if we can say that, health is being without disease, and then we can figure out what diseases are like. I mean, that would be good. Maybe we just find a whole bunch of examples of disease, and then we figure out what that implies about health. This is the last one's a more scholarly point, which is, well, let's look at the literature. Maybe some really smart people have written a lot of good things about this topic, and maybe we should just see what they have to say. That would be a good thing to do. I mean, this is, I'm sure, as people in the empirical sciences, you do this all the time, which is, yeah, man, that's a tough question. I bet someone else has looked into this. Okay. I've tried to, I'm usually pretty minimal about the things I put on slides, but okay, I put a nice quote for us. A very popular and influential definition of health is one proposed by Christopher Borse. And Borse is going to do, I'll read just the general quote for you here. This is one of those quotes nested in a quote thing. So the overall quote is from an article written by someone named Rebecca Kukla, but it's going to quote Borse in the middle. Okay. So by far the most influential attempt at a scientific definition of health and disease is Christopher Borse's account, which focuses on the notion of statistically normal function. He defines the normal function of a part or process within biological members of a class as, quote, a statistically typical contribution by it to their individual survival and reproduction, end quote. Within reference classes of members of a species of a particular sex and age, he defines health as, quote, the readiness of each internal part or process to perform all its normal functions on typical occasions with at least typical efficiency, and disease as, quote, a type of internal state which impairs health, i.e. reduces one or more functional abilities below typical efficiency, end quote. In other words, roughly, Health is statistically normal function, and disease is a state leading to below normal function. Okay. So, yeah, I see people are bringing up the World Health Organization definition, and there are things we can say about that. I was debating using the WHO definition as my example case here, but I chose to use Boris's instead. Okay, so I see a couple of people saying, looks like this Boris guy's got it figured out. While this is attractive, there are a couple big problems here. I think the first and most fundamental problem, and why this actually matters is going to maybe not be immediately clear. But a lot of the normative attitudes we have towards health rely on things like health is good, right? So if Boris's definition removes all value from it, we can't even say certain things like health is good. If it's just normal functioning, it doesn't follow why normal functioning means anything good, right? We have certain false positives and false negatives which are going to come out of this. The philosopher R.M. Hare points out that things like being shot and bleeding out are normal functioning falling below typical thresholds such that our survival is impaired. Okay. Most people aren't going to call being shot a disease, right? So in some way, we're already not tracking the definition we're interested in. Similarly, we're going to get certain false negatives, which is, well, there are endemic diseases like malaria that are really typical of a population in a certain location. So is malaria not a disease? Well, that doesn't seem to be right. I mean, even if a lot of people have a certain condition, and that doesn't seem to affect the extent to which we call it a disease. So we have some problems here, which is, first of all, if we think that health is a good thing, describing it in terms of simple statistical normality is not going to get us to the idea that health is good. It's just, health is effectively then just a statistical measure. So maybe it's really bad to be healthy. Maybe the normal of a certain population is terrible. Okay. And then, in addition, it doesn't seem to track what we really mean by disease. And then, if for Boris, health is just a lack of disease, we seem to have some problems here. So this definition doesn't really seem to track what's going on. So what's another direction we could go in? Well, maybe we can just retreat into the simple language of the fact. Well, I said that what's problematic with Boris's is that we call a lot of things diseases that Boris's definition either misses or Boris's definition suggests things which we don't call diseases. Well, okay. Maybe the other way to go about this is to just say, well, look, disease is a category in our language, and really, if we want to understand what we mean by disease, we don't need anything else. All we need is to just understand what people do in fact call disease, and then that's disease. And then what do people call health? That's what we mean by health. Now, one of the things that this would be an advantage of is, the definitions of health and disease have been historically contingent. And, so there hasn't been one consistent account we've had all the way through. So maybe if we retreat into language, then we're going to be able to embrace that. Okay, that seems interesting. But here's another problem. Okay, it's true that what people have called health has been historically contingent. And I'm sure some things in health are historically contingent. So, it probably mattered a lot more back in olden days if you could, withstand infection by contaminated foods, if you're eating rotted foods. And, our food preparation standards are a lot better now. So I guess that made a bigger difference across eras. But surely it isn't just pure historical contingency, right? here's a problem. In certain areas of the world, being homosexuals considered to be, it's said by people, to be a disease. So you're not healthy. We want to be able to say that that's wrong, right? Actually, that's incorrect, despite the fact that people identify it as such. So if what we mean by health is just, hey, look, just look at what people call health, just look at what people call disease, we're actually going to lose the ability to say that people are wrong. And as a result, we're going to lose also all of our scientific tools for investigating health. Even though the scientific tools that Bourse gives us, if used by themselves, don't give us an adequate account, if we try to write them completely out, we run into a similar problem. And then the same problem here, which is present in Bourse's definition, is that if we don't incorporate the types of normative attitudes that we like towards health, then we have a big problem. If we just say that health is what people call health, well, look, then we also can't say it's good to be healthy. So what do we have left? Well, there's a philosopher named R.M. Hare, who's he's a pretty smart guy, and he poses a really interesting concept for us to look at. So imagine there's a bacterium, and this bacteria species causes hair loss, okay? And so depending upon the mode of infection, it can either cause baldness on your head, or it can cause the loss of hair on one's limbs. Now, there's an interesting observation we can make about this, which is that, okay, most people don't want to go bald, but there are a whole lot of people who really regularly try to remove the hair from their limbs, from their legs and arms. So for the first group of people who don't want to go bald, having this bacterial infection would be a disease. But for the people who want to lose the hair from their limbs, it would actually be so good that we would actually turn it into some sort of cosmetic treatment, right? Here's my little fun fact. Does anyone know what the most potent toxin we've yet discovered is? Exactly. Spies got it. The botulinum toxin causes botulism. This is my favorite tale of human hubris, is that we took the most potent toxin we've ever discovered, and you know what would be good for this? We'll stab it into rich people's faces so that their skin will tighten up and they won't be as wrinkled, right? So, I mean, you can imagine this hypothetical bacteria being used in a similar way. So, what's going on then? I mean, why is it the case that we have the same bacteria causing a disease in one case, or a disease in one case, but actually something that's almost therapeutic in the other? Okay, why is this ethics for biologists or philosophy for biologists? It's ethics because I'm teaching the tools needed to do ethics investigation. We started with the foundations of normative ethics, and then we're circling back around, because all this analysis of health is being used to answer a normative question, which was, how much latitude do we give patients to act in a way that's contrary to their health? So what's going on in this test case? What's going on in the test case, which is if we apply Bourse's definition, okay, it's causing a species atypical function, which is loss of hair follicles. It doesn't affect survival, but so we should get this. I mean, Bourse's answer doesn't seem to track the fact that it would be considered a disease to people, but it certainly doesn't track the fact that one group this would be a disease for them, and another group it wouldn't be a disease. So what separates these cases? Hare's going to give us the interesting answer that we evaluate one condition as bad, and we evaluate the other condition as good. This means we're making a value judgment about the condition. So what tracks the fact that contracting this disease would make you bald? Why would that be a disease? Because we think it sucks to be in that condition. We make an evaluative judgment of it. We compare our sets of values to that reality. And the fact that we judge it as bad is what makes it disease. And the fact that we judge the other one as good is what makes it potentially even therapeutic. So, the important thing about health, if we buy this idea, is purely the normative stance we have towards the associated condition. That would be the position that Hare wants to leave us in, is that what unites the things that we identify as disease has to do with the normative stance we have towards those things. However, the investigation need not end here. What I'm not trying to do is just tell you, okay, that's what health is. I want to teach you some of the way in which you can actually do this investigation. So if we take this original question, which I'll say one more time, the original question is, how much latitude can we give patients to act in a way that's contrary to their own health? And then we want to investigate the term health. This might be a way we do that investigation. We do that investigation by looking at some definitions people have, comparing them to test cases, trying to find examples of the terms involved, and then thinking through what sorts of things actually stick. But there are other things we could do if we wanted to talk about health further. I mean, we talked about it in relationship to disease only, but maybe there's more. Maybe health isn't just the lack of disease, but it's something positive, like a state of flourishing or well-being. We had someone bring up the World Health Organization definition, and the World Health Organization definition is something like a combined state of mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and social well-being, I think that's it. And then, so that's a positive definition of health, as in it's something beyond just the lack of disease. But the problem, I'll just say, because people have brought it up, is the problem with the World Health Organization definition is that's like everything. The health is just goodness in general. Like if health involves spiritual well-being, that means we should make priests doctors, you know? Like we've just sort of given an account of like human flourishing. And so, I mean, I agree that we should look at a lot of stuff, but even in places like the World Health Organization, and I understand this is a digression, so I'll maybe save it for later, but health is clearly a concept with metaphysical spiritual weight to it. Well, I'm saying if we take what the World Health Organization is talking about, I think it does follow. This is just another approach to health I've seen about what other people have talked about. Okay, to end up, I just want to give you a couple more terms that you might find interesting. There's a really famous account of ethics that's relevant to people in the biomedical field called the Principles of Biomedical Ethics. This originally comes from a document called the Belmont Report that was produced by the Presidential Commission in the US, but it's since been turned into a book that's had like 8 editions by Tom Beecham and James Childress. And the idea is that we have, as biomedical practitioners, typically, and especially as physicians or clinicians, that we have 4 obligations that we ought to consider when we come face to face with our patient, which is our duties to justice, our need to respect patient autonomy, our duty of beneficence, and our duty to non-maleficence. Really briefly, I just want to say what each of those means, just because you'll probably recognize these terms. Like these are some of those ones where you swear you've never heard of it, but then all of a sudden this exact pairing will start popping out in odd places. So we can talk about some of these terms, but I'm looking at the clock now. So I'll leave it up to people, because people have been very well engaged in asking nice questions. So I'll let people in chat decide what they want to talk about, if that's more about the stuff I've said before, if you want to talk more about the principles of biomedical ethics. I know we've covered a lot of ground now, so it might be a mistake to put more content on top. Thank you to everyone for coming, though. I've been really appreciative to have the chance to talk to some people about some of the basics of normative ethics, and then give you some ways in which this might apply for biologists or clinicians. I am especially grateful. I know that this is outside of a lot of people's comfort zones, so I'm really glad that as many people as they did showed up to hear about something that you might not have had a lot of chance to hear about otherwise. So I think the procedure now is going to be that people can type questions in the lectures and conferences text channel. Then I'll read them out loud so people who are looking at the recording will be able to follow along. And we'll see what we can say. And you can either ask a question about a particular part or an extension. What I will say, though, is there are some questions where you might really want an immediate answer, but it would take like not an insignificant amount of time to start carving out the terrain. So I might ask you just to send me a DM afterwards, and we can talk about it later. But I'm going to try to make it so that there's as much time for people to ask things as they want. And thanks to everyone. A lot of people are saying very nice things in the chat about the talk. So thank you very much. Question. Given my comments throughout, what would you personally think our objectives should be when it comes to doing science? What outcomes should be desired in order to decide what we ought to do? Yeah, very good question. So I think the simple answer, and this might not be satisfying, but I'll expand a little bit. The simple answer is that, I think science has to be first and foremost motivated by a sense of normativity. Like, if you understand the structure of what should I do? You should do the good thing. I mean, that's like always true, right? So science is a way of, I think, trying to act out and achieve what we think the good ends are, right? So science is, in a sense, it's the justification we have for it is allows us to achieve things that reflect goodness in the most general sense. So I don't necessarily have the time right now to give you a complete account of like what exhausts normative theory, but I will say that I see science as an extension of our general project of achieving good things first and foremost. That might sound good derives from goals, which I'm asking about. At least I think so, but thanks. Yeah, I mean, like, I'd be happy. I'm around on Biocord, so for some of these more in-depth questions, I would love to actually be able to keep talking about them. It just might take more time than I want to keep people around here for, but just to give you an idea, we could also talk about, there's the question, so I talked about value theory. There's also the question of whether or not there are epistemic values. So, like, why is it a good thing that we value coherence in our thoughts? Well, some people think that we should explore those values in the same way that we should explore moral values. Like, they're just things that we think are valuable. What's my background? I'm a PhD student in bioethics and philosophy. I teach at a couple universities, and I teach all sorts of stuff in the bioethics and philosophy world. From Dr. Frogs, we all may know that science is a problem of being tainted by quote-unquote cultural framing, putting it lightly, of investigations in the first place. How much do you think this is a problem in ethics too? It's a big problem. It's differing levels of problem depending upon what your mode of investigation is. So I'll try to demonstrate it in some of the way we talked about our problems today, which is one of the methods I proposed for investigating health is to look at all the things people identify as diseases and all the things people identify as health, and then try to draw an account out of those. Okay, well, here's a really immediate problem. The things you might identify as disease and health are themselves culturally contingent. So how much are you stuck? How much can you proceed from that? So if the question is, how much do you think it's a problem in ethics? it can be a really big problem, particularly if you're trying to use those types of intuition-based approaches. From Barbie Biologist, why do different countries go about ethics differently? Why is euthanasia banned in most countries but allowed in others? So this is, I think, first and foremost, a descriptive question. I would ask probably an anthropologist before I'd ask someone like me, because it's going to relate to the cultural realities of those different places. I'll say that one place to look at would be the Netherlands is the most permissive country in the world for euthanasia. People also call it physician-assisted suicide. So if you want to look at, I don't know what Danish anthropologists have had to say about that, that would probably be the farthest place to go. Question: how do you feel about the idea of medicalization being a social construct? Can you expand more? Because people mean different things by medicalization. From DC Kill, thanks a lot for introducing the mental and conceptual tools required to approach ethics in biology and medicine. You are welcome. I was expecting some mention of major controversial topics in biomedical research and the proper structured way to approach the ethical discussion on them, but your points on biophilosophy and epistemology were great too. I'm glad, yeah. There are a lot of really classic problems in the field. What do you think about abortion? What do you think about euthanasia? And those are all good questions. They're just not ones that there's a flip side to them. So the good part is that everyone has heard about them and everyone has an opinion. So that's good because a lot of people have never heard anything about your field. So that's cool. For those of you in the hard sciences, I'm sure you would kill to have every person in society know something about your field of research. So that part's nice. The flip side is they're not always as a result the easiest way is to approach the field either, right? People are often primed to get into a culture wars discussion about it. And yeah, I have other things I can say about that too, but I'll leave it at there. Question: what books do you suggest as further reading for this talk on bioethics? I have a number. In part, it depends upon your interests, but I can give some general recommendations that I'll put in chat. Question from Barbie Biologist. Based on your answer to my previous question, how big a role do you think culture plays in ethics? It plays a funny role in both directions. So the first is trying to realize which of your intuitions might be culture and just simply cultural. I don't want to say bias, because bias sometimes brings on more baggage than we'd like. How much of your intuitions are just cultural preference, but then also if there's a question of should you express ethical sensitivity to different cultures, that might be a way in which culture also works in the other direction. You might have to know something about someone's culture because you have an obligation to, say, serve different diets or do other things to people. So the cultural question works in a couple ways. Sorry if I'm talking fast. I'm trying to make sure I keep up with people. So this is a follow-up on Hamisha, I think that's how you pronounce your name. Medicalization, meaning the process of declaring something as a disease. For instance, how obesity is considered a disease. One of my favorite articles about this is Rebecca Kukla's article, which I think Spy has put up a link to the reading group. I had our reading group read this. It's called Medicalization, Normal Function, and the Definition of Health. It's the thing I quoted from to give Bors's definition. And so I think that the best way to probably mediate what we consider medical is what Kukla advocates in that article, which is, well, look, the things we call the health institutions are really contingent. My favorite example is why is a dentist not a doctor in the same way that a doctor is? Why are psychiatrists not? But then even, surgeons used to not be considered doctors because surgeons removed things, whereas doctors added things. So how do we account for that while still not falling completely into that type of bad sense of historical contingency that we brought up? Like the fact that disease is just what we call disease. I think the best answer is what Kukla gives. Her answer is that the things which we should medicalize are those things which ought to be entrusted to our currently existing medical institutions. So we take advantage of the fact that our current medical institutions are contingent, but then we still do a normative evaluation of what we therefore entrust to them. she'll give the example, being illiterate is a type of mental problem that impairs your well-being in society, but we don't think it's a doctor's job to teach literacy, for example. I hope that was helpful. Why do you think biology ought to follow bioethics? Why shouldn't we go full-on mad scientist? Because if you understand the structure of normativity, you would realize that you can't think you ought to do something and then not do it. So if you find the idea of normativity like actually existing, then you can't understand it and not do it. Never seen so many questions pop up after a lecture. I'm glad. I'm glad that this is something that has got people's minds going. I've off. Might be a bit of a philosophical question, but do you think there's a non-cultural aspect to ethics? I do, yes. I think that there is an actual fact of the matter that can be discussed. What is a bioethicist view of companies involved in medical fields deciding what to work on based on return on investment and profit margins rather than unmet needs, etc.? Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental answer is there's no reason to think that those two things are going to coincide. So if you don't think they coincide, then you're bound to be set up for problems. I think the practical question is to what extent can they be made to coincide through political wrangling? And the answer is mixed, right? In some cases it works okay, in some cases it really doesn't work. So that's the conceptual point is that those two things don't coincide, and then the empirical question is to what extent can they be made to coincide? I would say ask an economist, but don't ask an economist. I'll say that if we need to wrap up, I'm around on Biocord, so you can always try to ask me questions if you find me, and I can always answer the best I can. Yeah, I'm really grateful to have been given the chance to come speak to everyone, and thanks to everyone for being so engaged. It's nice to not only have an audience, but have the audience be interested in what you're saying. So thank you.